Okay, so I just wanted to say that this past weekend, which was the weekend of the 19th and 20th, there was the celebration of the 250th birthday or anniversary of Paul Revere's famous midnight ride, where he was warning the settlers that the British were coming. Or I think he actually said the regulars were coming because a lot of the settlers apparently still consider themselves British subjects. And shortly after the midnight ride in Boston, so this was happening in Boston on the Sunday, the 20th, there was the celebration of the Battle of Lexington, which was the famous battle where the phrase "a shot heard around the world" comes from. And all I have to say is how ironic that on this kind of pivotal 250th anniversary, I will declare that Louis Tomlinson, you have convinced me, and actually you've reminded me that I'd much rather have a British boyfriend than an American one right now. Actually, I think I've always thought that because I did not grow up in the United States. And I actually, when I think about it, the early relationship history were actually Brits. So, you know what? I'm going back to my roots in a weird roundabout way. I'm not British, but yeah, I think I really prefer a British boyfriend because there's just something about people that are raised in older cultures where they're kind of like they reflect that sort of wisdom of the ages. You know, there's a theory in psychology called the Vygotsky theory, where he said that it is the culture that raises you that has a very influential part in the development of your personality, and it's the society and the culture that raises you over time, which is the scaffolding effect, where you build upon your knowledge base. Like you don't forget what you learned before, you just build upon it. And it is the the formative years where we spend time, whether it's geographically in a certain location or the big influence at home, is the culture that raises us that influences our personality. And of course, that leads me to say that of uh, yes, of course, we'd have someone like a Louis Tomlinson who reflects that wisdom, even though in a very young age when he was picked to be in One Direction, he just turned 18. So, and given everything that we know that he's accomplished, from being able to extract him and the band from that very restrictive contract with Psycho and Modest Management without the need to go to litigation, without a protracted legal fight, which you've seen that with people like if you go back to George Michael and his fight with Sony, it took a lot of gumption and it took a lot of emotional intelligence. And yes, somebody else in the comments said that Louis is their comfort person. He is totally my comfort person and has reminded me that, you know what? Get a British boyfriend. They're just, they just tend to be calm, even though, like you look at when they were younger. And, Simon Cowell has said that when One Direction, it was like having a bunch of little puppies because of the age they were. But even when they were kind of like just coming into adulthood and were like rambunctious, there still was this kind of wisdom about it. And again, they're growing up in an old culture, and it as much as it's modern, they've got the weight of history behind them. And what we consider like antique in the United States is, or US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, those younger countries consider antiques is nothing. Like there are taverns in the UK that are like still operational and they've been around since the 16th century, and you've got like tables that are 300 years old. So that's antique. So there's just this, the learning from history, they have just got a richer history because the US is under 500 years old, but Britain goes back to, I think Roman Britain goes back to before like the year 1000, right? So I just I think when I look at Louis, probably the reason why I'm a complete Louis girl is that a lot of his qualities and traits reflect this maturity. And he was on his own at a young age because like he got taken from his family when he got put in the band, and you wonder, like, he just kind of had the equivalent of high school at the time. He hadn't gone to university, that was his plan, but then life and fate had other ideas, and you wonder, how did he get this way? Well, number one, I think the British school system is just better because they still teach grammar over there. Two, Again, I think that there is I think there's just more of like a prowess of intellect that is in the education system, is in the if, really good BBC programming, not the crappy BBC programming, but really good BBC programming uh, is is pretty good. Now, if you think of like Monty Python and the kind of humor of Monty Python, a lot of times, there's that saying that Americans will watch Monty Python, they won't really quite get it, but if you were a British audience member watching some of the old Monty Python classical skits, you'd be laughing and howling because there's a lot of subtext you'd have to get. There's also the art of the absurd. There's kind of that the dark, sarcastic British humor. You kind of have to have reference points, and there's an emphasis on wit because, yeah, what what is found hilarious in the UK does not translate across the Atlantic and vice versa. Although I personally observe that British people they can understand American humor and they can understand their humor, but I've not seen it the other way around, where people that are in the US, they get US humor, but they seem to have a hard time with British humor, which I think is interesting. It's not necessarily about the different slang words or the accent. It's just there's an emphasis on wit and like again the subtext, or things are not quite what they seem. You have to I mean, I could be wrong. If anyone's British and is listening to this, if I'm wrong, just please tell me in the comments. But just my opinion has been that when I listen to British humor, I think you've got to have it's even in the inflection of the voice and how things are said. Like there's a lot of reading between the lines, which I think if you grow up in a culture that that's a thing, and everyone kind of seems to get it. It does sort of train you to read between the lines, just because you kind of would have to get the humor. Now, some people don't get the humor right away, but when you're a kid, you kind of ask, "Well, why is this so funny?" And then people start to explain it, and then you catch on. And it by nature, I think, because the humor is sometimes not so in your face, it's not so obvious, it's not constantly relying on physical comedy and slapstick. It sort of trains you, like the culture kind of trains you, is like kind of what Vygotsky said, the scaffolding effect of being able to read between the lines, which clearly Louis would have had to have done in order to have accomplished getting out of that contract and all the things I've covered in other videos. But given how young he was when he sort of began this long game of freeing from the original contract that was so restrictive after the X Factor formed them, it just makes me appreciate the um, just the wit of all that and the appreciation of wit. So personally, I will have to say that Louis Tomlinson has become sort of like an icon in my head, where if I get really pissed off sometimes, and given the kind of the research I've done, because I was just so interested in how he managed to do what he did, I I kinda, like, think, "What would Louis do?" Which is kind of funny that I do that, 'cause when I was a kid, I used to think, "What would Madonna do?" 'Cause she was kinda like all that to me, right? Not anymore, she's crazy. Well, not crazy, but she's kind of goofy now, just she's become a caricature of herself. But, yeah, so, I as much as Louis apparently called himself a chav in that, like, the Telegraph Standard article recently, I don't know, like, I'm convinced. I think I'd rather just have another boyfriend that's British. Mainly because they seem to really understand me, but again, I don't know, maybe it's confirmation bias, but yeah, Louis all the way.